Welcome to Muckrakers, where we dig through the latest happenings around so called AI. In each episode, we highlight recent events, contextualize the most important ones, and try to separate muck from meaning. I'm your host, Jacob Hames, and joining me is my co host, Igor Kravchuk.
Thanks, Jacob. This week, not much else happened, so we have plenty of time for our main topic. The only marginally interesting thing is that we have robot foundation models now. Sergey Levine and his spin off have released a paper where we talk about a generalist robot control agent that can work with 6 different types of robots and across many different tasks. And as might have been expected, more data is also good for robots.
Who could have guessed? But what we are talking about today is the U.S. National Security Memorandum regarding AI, which was published, or released on October 24th by the executive branch. And we'd like to start with why you should care. I mean, in this case, I feel like it's pretty cut and dry. The U.S. is not only the hegemon, more or less, but like is also the leading power in AI. And this memo gives us insight into how the military-industrial complex, which is really the big weight of the U.S. behemoth, is going to be incorporating AI into its processes and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, not only is it the hegemon in power and AI, it's also really, really, really rich. And there's funding decisions in this memo. It's worth
Yes.
saying that this is the last in a series of memoranda, executive order, other stuff from the executive branch. And this one is mainly focused on military and national intelligence stuff. We will also take a small deep dive into the civil branch after we talk about the memorandum.
Yeah. And then just to make sure it's clear what all the things we're talking about today are, originally, I believe October 30th of last year was when the executive order from Joseph R. Biden, is how he signs himself, was released. So that executive order is sort of like the highest thing that the executive branch in the U.S. Gives out in terms of like, here's what you should do. So the executive branch and Biden released this last year, and there was a decent amount of coverage of it. People across different sectors were like excited or not about it. It didn't really seem to have any direct impacts immediately, which makes sense. But that is sort of like how things happened. Then on October 24th of this year, so a year after it was originally released, there is this national security memorandum, and it is basically an update, a continuation of this um, executive order, but specifically regarding national security, with very explicit callouts and deadlines and deliverables and that sort of thing, which were in the first one. There were also deadlines and deliverables and all that stuff in the first one, but this is just the next step of those. Also released with this is a framework for working with AI, and this was, I guess, what was your take on like the frame? Is the framework just giving specific guidelines directly from the executive branch?
I would say like it is more how this particular section of the executive branch, so like national security and intelligence, has decided to approach working with and using AI. So they lay out things they will not do, which are nice, but we'll get back to those. They will also say what is high impact, what is less high impact, and how do you deal with those things. So the executive order pushed for a bunch of stuff that was mainly reports and getting ready to do things, because a behemoth should not twitch, so everything is very well deliberated and up to standards. And both the memorandum and the framework are like the next step of these very deliberate things, which then you basically refers back to previously made reports. The main ones to highlight might be the AISI, which I confused with CAIS in one of the previous episodes. So, like, I congratulated Dan Hendricks for being the main contact point of the US government. That is not the case. That is on me, mea culpa. But this is the internal section of the US government that is trying to figure out their AI policy. And they have already made guidelines and recommendations in collaboration with other government branches, and now this framework refers to those guidelines and recommendations, but like tweaks them further for the internal usage. And then that's what this then does. And my take is that, as somebody who didn't study political science and is just a nerd and has read up on this now, that a lot of this is to clarify in budget negotiations, in jurisdiction, or like what you're allowed to do discussions, what like the decision is, and also what the responsibility is.
Yes. I think there is also so this is actually a good segue into what the media is saying about it and how it's being talked about, right? So, unlike maybe some of our normal issues or topics that we discuss on this podcast, this one also affects a very different sector of media, which is like military press and other press and like magazines and coverage of that area of the
Government
military
contractor sector.
Yes. So this sector has picked this up as we got to move faster on AI stuff. Like we need to be implementing the well-scoped, useful pieces of AI better, and like there's money to be had in that realm. Is sort of how I'm picking up what they're saying there. And there's a decent amount of coverage, so I think that's not going to go unnoticed. On the other side, the ACLU, which is a longstanding organization, which is, I think, American Civil Liberties Union, and they basically try to support civil liberties of people and like make sure that those rights aren't infringed upon. And they say this is not enough. So there are explicit callouts from the ACLU that's saying this is not far enough in terms of what we want to see from the government saying they won't do with these systems. And then the last group is really, I guess, that the tech people, or even going to like the AI doomer crowd. And I think Igor, you had some thoughts on like why we're seeing relatively no fanfare around this from them.
So when we say no fanfare, we checked before the recording and we found one tweet by Dan Hendricks commenting on one of the deadlines. A single post on Less Wrong, it was a link post with basically just referring to a cringe blog post being correct, which we will not further platform, except that it was referenced. And that was kind of it. And I think you mentioned a newsletter mentioned it as like AI is now a national security consideration.
Yep, the Case newsletter also mentioned it, but to be fair, the Case newsletter was published on October 24th. So like they probably didn't have much time to really engage with it before they released this.
So we tip our hat to the response time for including it at all.
Indeed.
But yeah, like for the thing of why it's not very highly picked up is because for us, this brought this on our radar, and we think it's worth talking about it as a launch off point, but is actually not changing a lot. It is changing some things quite concretely, but they are like on the behemoth moving, and that's why it's important scale, not on the oh my god, the government has released America GPT.
Right. So, like Igor said, we're using this as a jump off point to discuss like what the United States government, uh, what their take on AI and like how to use it and how to go about navigating this emerging technology, um, in addition to the specific items within this uh, national security memorandum. So, getting to like what's actually discussed in here, because I mean, it is a lot of text. Um,
And it's worth saying that like this text has the force of law, so it's very dry and very detailed jargon. But for what it is quite clear as well. Just it's like reading source code. You're not gonna get a nice summary that lays out everything. You do need to kind of grind through it.
well, so actually, there is like a decent summary. Uh, it's just the fact sheet that they published, which is like their own TLDR, and uh, that's okay. The like shortest version that I can condense it to is really just taking a paragraph from here, which is that this memorandum directs the U.S. government to implement specific things to ensure that the United States is going to be the leader in developing safe, secure, and trustworthy AI. And that trifecta of words is important and comes up a lot within the actual security memorandum. Um, it is going to harness cutting edge AI technologies um, to achieve their goals. So basically, use AI more in meaningful and useful ways, which is getting back to what the military industrial complex press picked up on. And then lastly, it's going to advance international consensus and governance around AI. And then my asterisk to add in there is with an emphasis on what the US wants, which makes sense. Obviously, that's what they're going to do. But it is called out explicitly within the text of the National Security Memorandum. Like, we want to promote democracy and democratic values within the use of these technologies. So that is also, I mean, makes sense according to like what we would expect, but worth mentioning. So this is really the cleanest summary that I can give. But it touches on a lot of different items, including like chip manufacturing as well. So they're not keeping this narrow, and they're not keeping this hand wavy, which I think is really worthwhile.
Yeah, I think you can kind of bucket it into like two sections of like deadlines and general guidelines that are still concrete but just like don't have these like time deliverables, and then there's like some main sections in both of them. And I would say like the guidelines is basically take AI seriously. So there's stuff in there about you need to have a responsible person within, like as a general rule. These are the responsibilities. You need to have a board. This is what they do. Um, Follow the law, which is nice. And they also specifically call out like harms that they care about, which was an interesting thing to observe.
Yeah, so maybe we can start or not start, but like just mention what those harms are because I think like what they have decided to call out is interesting. Specifically, the harms that they call out are risks to physical safety, privacy harms, discrimination and bias, inappropriate use, lack of transparency, lack of accountability, data spillage, poor performance, and deliberate manipulation and misuse. So to me, I feel like these fit into a couple different buckets. Um, one of which is like majority of them is like things that we should care about for any new technology, right? So like risks to physical safety. Yeah, we want to make sure that we address this and we look into it. Um, Discrimination and bias. We want to make sure that we aren't perpetuating or making worse the bias and the discrimination that's already in play. Um,
I mean, it's worth pointing out that like it is specific to AI in the sense that like a gun doesn't have bias. So like they're like incorporating actual understanding of it, and I'm giving them kudos for the lack of performance being an explicit risk that they focus on, and I'm very happy about what isn't on this list as well.
So I would agree. I guess the first thing to say is like I totally agree. I think poor performance being on here is like one of the better outcomes we could have seen is that the government is basically explicitly acknowledging like sometimes these systems aren't performing the way that they're being sold. Um, and that is a harm in that if it doesn't meet the standards and it was sold as being able to meet the standards robustly, like that's not okay. That is a harm that can cause concrete harm. Um, Similarly, inappropriate use. So if someone's using one of these systems when they shouldn't be, that is a harm. Um, and then I think going back to what you said, what isn't in these, I think you have stronger opinions than I do about like what you're happy to see isn't in here. What are your thoughts?
So like what isn't on here is sci-fi bullshit. Like they're really
Right.
grounded on like the risks that are there. I think some section of the document talk about like bio risk and other things, and that was like in a separate report found explicitly to not be a risk right now. In like the the NIST companion framework for generative AI, they discuss that current models don't really have that, and there was also very little speculation in there. But in this context, because it's national security, it kind of makes sense if they at least like mention, check out how this can be used for bioweapons, check out how this can be used for nuclear weapons, check out how this can be used for chemical weapons, because like it's weapons stuff, and it might also include things like delivery methods and drones and like new versions of Stuxnet to attack nuclear reactors. So like it makes sense within that thing, and I'm very happy to see that at least right now the behemoth appears to be acting rational in that they're looking into emerging stuff, but what they're reacting to, like the actual reactions that will channel billions of dollars into different places, is actually the stuff we care about, or
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion, we should care about. And going back to the thing about performance, the concrete deliverables, a lot of them are investigate whether and how to use these things in an appropriate manner,
Mm-hmm.
which is also very good.
Yeah. So the concrete, I guess like different areas that are called out in terms of like potential harms, other than just the more general things, are biochem, and in almost all cases, biochem is coupled. In this, there's one in which only bio is mentioned, but basically everywhere else, it's bio and chem together. That's one area that is getting special attention. Another area that's getting special attention is nuclear and radiology or radiological. So how might these systems help with making nuclear weapons or other nuclear related risks? That gets explicitly called out because it is of high potential threat. And the last one is cyber, is explicitly called out a couple times as a specific vector in which we should be looking into for both defense and potential threat vectors in there. Um, those are like the threat domains that are called out, but there are also some other things that are paid special attention to within this national security memorandum, which are a little bit more eclectic, but are mentioned a couple times, so it's worth bringing up. The chip, uh, computer chip manufacturing pipeline is called out specifically multiple times as a key piece that should be looked into, which I think is intelligent and like well informed
In
of
terms of investment, or you mean the supply chain security?
in terms of both actually. So it includes bringing people in, and this is another one of the areas that's um mentioned multiple times is talent acquisition and person acquisition effectively of the most intelligent and useful minds in this area. I guess probably just the best people to be working on this, and trying to make it as easy as possible for them to get in to the U.S. while also not loosening security measures in that regard. So that is a theme throughout this that we see, and they explicitly mention that that includes silicon chip um, and the semiconductor manufacturing pipeline. In addition to then like analyzing the threat, doing a threat analysis of the pipeline and like what the nodes are that you would want to make sure are robust to a potential foreign actor that is malicious. So those are also themes. Is there may be one more? I feel like there's one more. Evaluation is the last one that is seen a lot. So this is basically them just saying like, hey, we got to be able to rapidly test these systems, and we want to have good ways to do that, and we also want to tell all of our agencies, hey, this is how you should be doing this. Which again, I think is pretty reasonable to just say we want to be able to analyze these well and efficiently, and that
We're being a bit high level here because we don't want to make it too dry. Because, like, for me, this was very interesting to read, but I think for most normal people, this will be a very dry read. But like, you can take what they put into a document on what they call out, also what is in the NIST reports, what's in the guidelines by the AISI. It all makes sense. Like, this is not like the government is talking about BERT, the old school transformers, while everyone else is looking into state-space models. Like, they're more or less on the bleeding edge in what they're calling for. And the way they're doing things seems extremely well measured. Modulo, this being the executive branch kind of like self planning and self imposing constraints. Because, like, in the framework, they talk about some constraints that they do, which we also very like, because they say things like, don't make immigration decisions with an AI without having a human look at it. And all of those are pretty good, but they're still like caveated and up to their own discretion in the limits. So that's like the only thing that we keep in mind. But they do just a lot of clearly good stuff. They foster collaboration between the DOE and the DoD and a bunch of other branches. They make explicit calls for pilot programs to provide compute to various actors. The way they're doing the investment is pretty sane. I think you pointed it out to me.
Yeah, so you actually mentioned last week when we were talking about the military-industrial complex, I like, and how they would allocate their money to different, I believe it was aviation businesses, basically. So people making planes, and how they diversify so that it encourages competition between them, and not there isn't one clear like superpower, because in terms of like in the aviation industry, because that is better for them and also better for innovation in general. And they explicitly call out within this framework that they will do that, that they will make sure to diversify their investments. And they go on to say many different areas in which they want to assess the feasibility and efficacy of incorporating LLMs, which they say AI, into processes. So, for example, I think you've mentioned in prior episodes, like, you have a AI or LLM like rigged code editor, Aria, is that right?
Ada.
Ada, and then Cursor is also getting like a lot of attention. Um, they're basically saying like, where there are things like this that are actually useful, we should develop best practices around them, and then we should use them because they seem really helpful.
I
Um,
don't think we're talking only about LLMs though, like because
that's also true. Yeah.
I'm sure it is the main driving factor right now because that's where the hype is. But they mention specifically also things in regards to like being able to move models and model weights to secure facilities, uh, and developing the capability for that. And that also tracks if they are talking about we want to have a highly sophisticated reinforcement learning trained control mechanism for our grid to have like national security via more stable electricity grid. So it is very clearly not talking only about foundation models. It's just AI. The only times when we say specifically foundation models is dual use foundation models of very large scale and things like that.
Hmm. In terms of like other items to note here, there is a classified annex of this memorandum, which addresses sensitive national security issues, which we do not get to see. Um, there is a claim, or not a claim, a statement that says the U.S. can prevent acquisition of AI companies by foreign actors for intelligence security reasons, which I thought was interesting. And there's also the a comment that on first read it sort of made me think, oh, maybe this isn't the best, but after um, discussing with some others, like I think that it does seem reasonable, and that is basically that the all of the different departments and institutions and whatnot within the government are now explicitly charged with considering that AI tools may be used to reveal classified information from declassified material. So the example is like if the PDF or whatever isn't like sufficiently redacted, and you can like open up the PDF and then move the little black box away from the words and just like look at the words, or if you can turn up the um, like resolution or detailing in some sort of photo editor to get the words either as well.
Yeah, those are like the ones that I think I can't remember what it was. I wish it was something around either Musk or some other court case. They handed over a bunch of documents and they weren't properly redacted, and journalists were able to do that. Like the government is now probably already not doing that. But more importantly, I think it's in a world where classified stuff exists and like the consensus is that that shouldn't change. It's good to also be aware that like OS int exists. So like you can do stuff. There's 5 documents. They all talk about this classified thing. One of them has the name. The other one has the location. The other one has the thing, and you can like correlate those based on some other markers, and then you have like more information than you would have otherwise. And the time where you might have gotten away with it is kind of over because you need to assume that every bad actor and also every good actor, like activists are also fucked over by this. So that's like the sad thing of this. But every bad actor is gonna like archive all of your data and do all of the correlation attack that they can. And I think it's just sane to do that if you have a government. And I also would expect to be that like the classified annex is nothing sinister. Like
Yeah,
it's just gonna be like all of that, but now for the NSA and naming locations or like subdivisions that are classified as well, and that's it.
yeah, I think that seems pretty reasonable. I just wanted to note that like that is one thing worth mentioning. Did you have any items that were like
The only
little tidbits that you found as just like single entries that might be worth highlighting?
There's one that I will maybe segue to for the what does this mean afterwards. The only other one that is just like highlighting is like president's gonna get briefings. Like part of the job of the AISI is gonna be like regular reports and briefings about basically the state of AI. including what the AISI thinks the adequacy of the evaluation measures is. So that's going to be interesting once they have like their own in-house capabilities who, if things go well with the government, are probably going to be like, if we get something like the Fed but for AI in the AISI, then this is going to be like some relatively critical top level expert who will not buy the bullshit that is
Mm-hmm.
sometimes sold. And let's hope it turns out that way.
Yeah, I guess the theoretical like downside is it's one of the you know people who have had the Kool Aid.
I mean, so far, like, I think it's Alan Kelly, or Kelly definitely is the, like so far things have looked good, and
That's
they
true.
look grounded, and like people don't work for the US government for money generally.
Yeah.
I mean, like they do, but like not it's
Well,
not the like money optimizing career move is what I mean.
right. Yes. Um. Okay. So that leads us to like, how do we actually extract meaning from all this? Not just specifically this item, as in the National Security Memorandum on AI, but also um, the government's approach to AI. Like, what do we think are going to be the repercussions that impact us out of all this? People who are not government employees or already working for the DoD.
For me, one of the meanings is this groundedness is very heartening, and this is kind of like behemoth level government at its best, in the sense that it's very careful, very deliberative. It's still the executive branch doing the job that maybe Congress should be doing, but like, hey, you get what you get. And the fact that they use the words trustworthy and not just trusted is actually something I wanted to highlight. That like this combination of like everything is very grounded, and that actually not taking for granted that this is gonna come. All of that is good, because if nothing else, even if you don't want to read further between the lines, it means that they're not rushing into deploying some high P technology and putting the money hose open for everyone. Um, but, and I kind of segued into things for you.
Yeah, I think that this is indicating like a pretty substantial shift um, in the funding landscape. Um, and I don't know if that's for better or for worse here. I mean, in terms of like if you're an AI adjacent org, it's and you're looking at this from the purely like profit maximizing standpoint, then it's great. Um,
Profit maximizing or surviving, right? Like I mean, like you mentioned that like your group might actually be able to dock onto this depending on some details because of the talent pipeline thing, and like we had a mini conversation that we should probably not have in this podcast, but we can do like a Patreon version of that if people are interested. About how my perspectives onto the military industrial complex have shifted since the Ukraine war.
mhm.
And I think like the only salient thing from that is basically saying like funding in this field doesn't necessarily need to be like malicious or bad, even though it's definitely worth being scrutinized and challenged and shrunk. But where we I think agree is that this is gonna very much shift the funding landscape with a huge inflow in funding, where previously there was only VC funding and non DoD grants.
Yeah, so from like the from an engineering like an engineer's perspective, I my undergrad was in mechanical engineering and my master's was in computational modeling, and majority of the jobs that I could get are funded by the DoD essentially. um and I think that is what we're going to see is a shift towards that. Where I'm not saying necessarily like an overnight shift, but I do think that we're going to see a lot more DoD funded, effectively, either orgs or even whole areas within the AI space. And there may be some newer jobs at like the higher up organizations. They may also just like promote someone that's already doing something, say, hey, you're also doing this. Um, but I do think that the Department of Defense is going to start putting its money behind these technologies, and I think this is a signal that that is the case.
Yeah, which in the historical context is actually more a return to what was there before than an like massive shift. So that most people don't know this, but like first of all, like all of Silicon Valley exists because of military contracts in the beginning. Like there's the book like Palo Alto that goes into this. It's a well documented thing that like self-made man and like private industry growing innovation, that story was always bullshit. Silicon Valley exists because of military contracts.
Right.
um, Beyond that, computing and AI and optimization came out of military logistics. Like
Mhm.
uh, the Russians who figured out linear programming, and like Danzig and the other people in the US who did the equivalent, like they were doing like statistical and operations research, analysis, and algorithmic development for the military, like to optimize schedules, to balance assignments of different resources according to different costs. There was like one interesting quote from a book, The Closed World, which talked about the war of the future will be simply fought by analysts and their linear programs. We will not fight, we will simply run the optimization program, and then the war will be decided by who would lose if we were to fight it, but it will be much more economical. There's like stuff like this. And we're just going back to that. We're just like, and already now people also need to be aware, like lots of labs also outside the US are funded by the Office of Naval Research, the various DoD grants. Like the sexiest stuff, the big bucks are all in the US, but Europe is getting crumbs as well for like generic uh, optimization research. That is basically the US government saying, yeah, like we'll take a 5% decrease in time to wait for our massive logistics schedule. Uh,
Yeah, and there is one thing worth noting about that in the national security memorandum is that it also explicitly calls out like we're going to investigate how feasible it is to have allies working on these problems with us as well. Um, so it is taking that into account. The last thing, how like I think though, in terms of like what the impact actually will be, it is that for some people, like maybe even Igor or other people that are in like let's say the UK or France, Germany, um, Eastern Europe,
China.
essentially. Well, not for the people in Eastern Europe. I think it'll be easier to come to the United States and get green cards or visas um, in this specific technical expertise because they
If they can
explicitly call
show
that
that they're
out.
safe.
If they can show that they're safe, which I think the burden of proof will probably be lower for people from that area.
So there's an interesting thing that Switzerland actually just started screening people from highly government affiliated universities. Like they do like background checks now that they
Yeah.
didn't used to do.
So Chinese or Russian immigrants are probably going to have a harder time getting into the U.S. for those same areas because their burden of proof will be higher, and so that is another impact um, that I think is notable.
Yeah, so that's also going to be interesting because the government will then be trying to compete with frontier labs, with tech corps, with whatever, and that money hose might have like rippling effects that we aren't fully considering because we were kind of an anomaly between 2004, 2002, and now, where the bulk of funding was coming from industrial, basically ads. Google, to some degree, then like Microsoft, all of these like really big AI companies that
Mm-hmm.
initially were funded mainly via ads and then like platform shit that is often ads. And now there's gonna be like a different player in there where like I have an industrial AI job, which I love because I like actually creating value and not just target people. And there's not that many of them. But now there will be, with the extra caveat that it's going to be like national security stuff, but it's not going to be ads anymore. But they will have like the deep, deep, deep pockets of the military industrial complex, which will probably take a few years to ripple through, but that's gonna shift things as well, like as a secondary effect of the competition for talent and stuff like this.
Mm-hmm. And I think if we assume, I mean, I guess we probably shouldn't be assuming anything, but generally military uh, technologies or technologies that are supported for the military in like their origins do end up having like a industry equivalent. Um, so I don't think this necessarily means like things are going to slow on the consumer side. Um,
Unless they deliberately try to cripple it, like with
sure.
crypto, like cryptography, this happened. Like we got like a shitty little crypto standard that was deliberately crippled. Like DS56, I think, was a thing where they limited the key because they wanted to do this thing of like, oh, we have a key, but it's also strong enough for the plebs, and then that was broken. Where in this case, I don't think that's gonna be as easy. I think like if the US decides that like you get 1 meter of precision of GPS, and if you want more, you should launch your own satellite constellation, and that was just how it was for a long time. And you still don't get like weapons precision GPS internationally. And it's going to be the same thing with AI slash control algorithms, which it already is. Like, I think if
Yeah.
you're doing like control AI, you probably just fall under existing aviation control export.
Oh,
And this is going
absolutely.
to get more.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're talking about like system control, I would say that
Yeah, like
they aren't
thrusters.
even.
Like if I have like
Yeah.
an AI algorithm that does model predictive control to for a jet, that shit's gonna be looked at, I would assume.
I mean that's already looked at. Like that's already
Yeah.
within that I would say that they are not. Well, that is like AI in this sense that we're talking about, where it's like machine learning to get to that point. Um, they are not considering those sorts of uh, learned algorithms for stability, for example, of a drone. Um, that is not considered like part of the machine learning aspect. It's more considered the part of the aviation aspect and is regulated through that. Uh, is my understanding.
Which, like, assuming this is correct, because none of us are lawyers, and none of us are aviation regulation experts, even though you probably have some relevant knowledge. But like, this is again a thing. Like, this doesn't change much, but it also might change a lot because it's just like now a more expansive language, right? Like before you had like aviation ML is covered by this, and now even if the LLM stuff, the bubble bursts and everyone just stops talking about AI, there is now this regulation in place that derives its authority from like stuff that I don't think anyone will ever touch, like the Patriot Act and the Defense Production Act, that uh, means it's probably going to stick until it gets challenged in court and ruled against, or a contravening law is passed. And that means all of AI and ML is now potentially within the reach of these regulations, depending on how they want to play it. So I think that's like a takeaway.
Yeah.
But let's maybe move to the civil side. So this was
Yeah.
national security and military-industrial complex. There is actually also a non-military side to the US government, even though some people might be surprised by this.
I know, it's pretty shocking.
And there's valiant efforts to change that fact by various political groups, which shall not be named. And inshallah, in 2 days, we know that they will have failed for a while.
Oh, really?
Uh,
It's that soon?
Election, like,
Oh, yeah.
um,
Sorry,
but
I'm just like operating under a facade that that's gonna happen, and hoping that if I forget about it, it won't happen.
let us not dig up any more scars about this. But let's talk about the exciting world of requests for public consideration of regulations developed by the Bureau of Industry and Security.
Yeah.
So, for some context, and everyone who was in here for guns and exciting things can now tune out, because now we're talking about the minutiae of how a bureaucracy does things, with the added bonus of what it tells you about the participant stakeholders.
I mean, I would argue that the last part there is the part that's like super interesting and like worth staying for though. So within the executive order last year, they did a bunch of stuff, right? And one of those things was to have basically like reporting requirements. They say we would like reporting requirements, or we would like to require reporting of training of large models, large language models. In addition to a couple other things, I think they had specific things for like bio. There was a specific, if you use biological data within your training data, then you need to do some other stuff. But that's not really relevant right now. We're just talking about like the larger blanket. You've got a big model, you're training it, and they had until October 11th of this year to put comments into what had been proposed.
To be precise, there was a deadline for the government agency in charge of making the requirements
Oh, right.
to get started. And then they made the requirements. And then for these requirements, they've now called for public comment. And there's still some things ongoing for some other things. And people gave comments, and that's what we're talking about now. And
Yes.
what they called for comments for specifically was they basically proposed, give us quarterly updates, tell us what you're training, what you're building to train stuff, a bunch of other things with like potential security impact, and now tell us, is quarterly okay? Is the threshold for consideration okay? So like there's like tens of billions of parameters. Is that an okay definition? And any feedback on securing the information both in transit and the way we handle it, and also anything else you would like to tell us. That's basically what they asked.
Yeah. And so we've got the people that you would expect to be commenting on this, in addition to maybe some other people who you might not expect. So first, let's talk about the people that you would expect. OpenAI and Anthropic have obviously commented on this. And what's interesting about their comments, maybe not, it's interesting regardless, not necessarily unexpected, depending on how cynical you are. But they are pushing for less frequent reporting than quarterly.
Yeah, and maybe we should also say explicitly who we else expect to say things. So like there's like, people affected by this. So OpenAI, Anthropic, obviously. Also a company called Hugging Face, which is like a ML community hub, like GitHub for models. And then there's like the AI safety think tank scene. So there's Meter, there's the FLI, Future of Life Institute, that still has funding somehow, I don't know. There's Miri, Eliza's entity.
Well, so I would say that it splits into, so like you can say like research orgs and think tanks that are like EA aligned, I guess, but that sort of splits into two different categories. There's like the pure research or more research focused, like Meter or Miri, and then there's the ones that are like very policy oriented, like uh, CAPE, Center for AI Policy, and GovAI, and those things. So like I would say those are both entities, like types of entities that I would expect to see commenting on this, and they do comment on this. So
And it's worth contrasting how they comment on it, right? Because did they call for a reduction of frequency of reporting?
no, they actually call for increase, and they say quarterly is absolutely the lowest you should go. You should actually probably consider increasing the frequency or having some sort of mandate regarding updates to like proposed plans that happen. So when compared with OpenAI and Anthropic, who are asking basically for weaker definitions, and to make the time semi-annual as opposed to quarterly, which also just as to highlight doesn't really make sense because we know that like OpenAI spun up O1 in like 3 months, right?
No, we don't know that. What we do know is that they release things in a 3 month cadence, and I would still assume that O1 wasn't planned to be released this early because, I mean, look at it. But
Yeah.
like they claim that the timelines internally are so long that 6 months is totally fine, it's enough. But I would argue that no, just do it quarterly because they also argue. I want to emphasize like OpenAI. Actually, the interesting thing for me in this is that OpenAI behaved better than Anthropic in my eyes in this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And
So
before we
tell us
go into,
why.
I also want to say like the reason why we're highlighting this is because this is like an object lessons in revealed preferences. Like, don't tell me what you do, just show me what you do, and I will tell you what you actually do. And OpenAI wants less reporting. They want proprietary information protected, which is fair. They want a mechanism to streamline reporting, to be able to say, nothing changed, and a bunch of other details that are all absolutely reasonable if you're a business doing this who doesn't think it's actually a big risk and
Yeah.
who just like to get away with a minimum amount of reporting that they think they can get away with in the existence of a president telling them that you have to report stuff.
Yeah, I would say that's like a very reasonable take. Is like this is a business who does not think it's an issue, and they're trying to make it as minimal as possible to reduce the overhead cost.
And it's not malicious per se, right? Like this is just like what you do if your government asks you, and it's like a thing that people I think also should appreciate that like government could just tell you to do shit, but they ask you for consideration. And whenever there's like, oh, all of the regulation is horrible, they don't know what they're doing. No, like actually they ask you. They ask you for input. Um, Anthropic has a slightly different perspective. They also want less frequent reporting. So that's why like they could genuinely be planning 6 months ahead. Like that's plausible. There's millions of dollars on the line. It takes a while, and maybe
But it's
they're
worth noting that every single educated group that also commented here said 3 months, so quarterly, is barely enough.
Some of them
So,
said 6 months is the lowest they would go, but they are happy with 3 months. So like none of them said, "Oh no, 6 months is too much. 3 months is too often. You should do less." And some of them said 3 months is the least frequent they would go.
right. So, like, on average, if we're looking at people who actually know what they're talking about here, we should be shifting it lower, not higher.
I agree. Even just because of the fact that that's one thing problem I have with the OpenAI statement as well is like if you are forced to compile a report and you're actually forced to compile a report that will put into hot water, it's a good nudge to check off maybe you got overconfident, maybe you got cocky. There's this term of normalization of deviance that came out of that Challenger disaster. That like you want mechanisms to check even if you think things are fine and don't need to be reported, you still might want to do it. So
Yeah.
like, yes, I agree with you, but like, and that's part of why we're talking about this. The public posturing of OpenAI and Anthropic of, oh, we care about safety, we will freely share safety information when possible, we will collaborate with everyone who is ahead of us for AGI. I think that's something Anthropic said. I'm unsure about OpenAI, but like all of this stuff, people like me who are like cynical said it's bullshit for a while, and with OpenAI, it's become a consensus. I do really believe that Anthropic thinks they're doing the right thing, but in my opinion, their actions reveal that they also don't really believe in this stuff. Because they should be happy about the reporting requirements if they actually thought there was a risk.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I say they really believe in that they're doing the right thing is the second thing that they did that is different from OpenAI. Like I showed it to you earlier. Do you want to summarize it, or should I do it?
Yeah, so essentially, there's a comment within this that says dual use frontier models, I think, is the
Yes.
current wording.
Which is
And
defined as basically just like a certain size and certain capabilities. And it's very broad and it doesn't mention what type of risk it could be causing. Just like dual use and big enough and potentially risky in a general sense is enough.
yes. And when you go and cross reference that with the National Security Memorandum, you see that that includes many different risks, including bias and privacy concerns and things like that. What Anthropic said is change this relatively like concise wording that, although it may be defined in larger amounts like in other media or literature, like it is something you can say concisely and you can discuss. um, Take that and throw it away, and instead add 2 or 3 paragraphs that essentially say in like very excruciating detail, um, only X risk, only extreme catastrophic risks, um, and then models that do not fall into that category would not be covered here. We would not need to report on models that do not fall into this category. Um,
And like, I'm trying to be nice here. So I think what they meant was, oh, we care about these risks. We would like to have this spelled out explicitly so nobody can like wiggle their way out of it or something like that. Or it's just like on their mind that oh, this doesn't mention X risk, therefore we need to put it in because like I don't know. Like I want to say this is not a like deliberate thing, but it's important to point out that this is causing harm. That if you narrow the definition, it is if you think reporting is useful in reducing harm, and you narrow the scope of what is reported on to something that is very difficult to prove, then you're doing harm because you've removed risk reduction techniques. And both OpenAI and Anthropic don't want to share their safety mechanisms either. They want that redacted if it's made public. So the whole thing about we want transparency as much as possible, we want this or that, it's kind of bullshit if you look at what they actually tell the government they actually want when it's legally binding, not legally binding, but like it might become law.
Yeah.
And it is worth contrasting that with the other think tanks who are maybe still, like, in my opinion, and I'm more strict on this or like more aggressive than you, like of the doomer anxiety variety, but like at least they're consistent. They actually believe in it, and I think that's like worth tracking for bridge building. Like if you are somebody like Timnit Gebru, who's not a big fan of like the Tescriel cluster, but like you want to build a coalition to actually regulate AI and protect people from harm, this tells you a bit like who is it worth talking to and who at least there's a lot of work to do before you can build a bridge out of that.
Yeah. And out of like the others that are mentioned, that there are two that I think are worth bringing up for very different reasons.
I would say
The
three.
first.
There's like two series and one like our little treat for today.
Oh, okay. I was thinking of the second one is that. So the one that I was thinking of, and then we'll hear the second one from you, was Mozilla commented, and they basically said, "Hey, what about open source? What about actually open source?" They didn't say actually, but that's what they meant. Although they may have meant open weights as well, which they last tangent. We have gotten consensus. Open weights is what we're going with for what I have sometimes previously called open release, because it was included explicitly in the National Security Memorandum. So I will cease using my other word and now call them open weights models. But just
behold
for
the power of the hegemon.
Yes. Anyways, that is what Mozilla said, and I thought that their requests seemed pretty reasonable, and were good for basically clarifying like how does this impact open models.
Mozilla also answered the comment about how should you like share this information with like cybersecurity concerns and less like keep this stuff secret. We want to keep our delicious proprietary evaluation techniques. So like that's worth pointing out. Actually, like it's like with Mozilla, Hugging Face is worth noting. Hugging Face is like a startup. They actually started out wanting to do like AI for psychology, like basically like AI shrink, which was a horrible idea. So thank God they pivoted into being the GitHub of AI. And they basically have good takes. They overall like the rules. What they comment on is, hey, your definition is too like exclusive. You should define things in terms of capabilities and context and not have a rigid number of parameters or compute number to it, because that shit changes and you want to be like capability oriented, which is a correct input actually.
Yeah, I would say it does require like a little bit of extra maintenance, I guess, because you'd probably want to still have that concrete level at some
everything that passes 70% on the math benchmark.
Sure.
Like,
I mean, yeah.
easy.
So I'm just saying it does require like a little bit of extra effort for them, but I think that's warranted in this case. Like I think it's a good input to say this should not be something that is concrete, or I guess not concretely, but rigidly defined, such that it is difficult to change if it needs to be changed.
And on the other side, something that I also found flag is like one of the takeaways from this section for people is kind of like, if you're into this stuff, like if you care about AI safety, if you care about what's going to happen, it's worth reading this stuff, but it's also probably worth writing in, because like the stakeholders are clued in already. Like we kind of are discovering this now because, at least like I I'm doing this as a hobby. I'm doing this as a passion, and I'm not into AI policy as a career. But every single AI request for comment thing will have Miri, GovAI, obviously, but also like Anthropic and OpenAI write and lobby the government. And uh, our last mention will make the point very clear that you can too. But
Well, I want to before you mention that, I want to say like Stakeout AI, which on my other
yeah,
podcast I
yeah,
talked with the founder, and unfortunately they had to dissolve because of funding pressure. Um, but they did this.
yeah.
They commented on exactly these kinds of things. Um, and I think it's important to note like that's a niche that is now empty. When you think about it from that perspective. So, um, like Igor said, the last one.
No,
Uh,
like there's a second to last one because
oh, okay.
who's also clued in is Americans for Prosperity
Oh,
and
right.
other like classical keep your government out of my business type think tank. So there was also like a a bit like an industry group like Alliance for Trustworthy AI or something like that. And
So yeah, I remember how I said only the educated people all said 3 months is good, 6 months is the absolute maximum, or 3 months is the absolute maximum, depending on who it was.
yeah,
Um, well, the other groups include these two, and one of them said 6 months with the
6 months is the absolute maximum frequency. Everything else is burdensome to innovation. And
and another advocated for a year. So,
no, the other one advocated for not doing it at all.
oh right, yeah. Well, so
So Americans for Prosperity thinks this is the Biden-Harris administration overreaching wildly and trying to stifle innovation and putting this emerging industry into a political framework. So like, even if you don't care about AI per se, it's probably worth like tracking stuff like this and making your voices heard. Like, because like commerce is also how like media is shaped. And if you're like a civil rights or other like social justice org, you might want to track like everything that has to do with like media because they are.
they
But
sure
so
are.
is our final hero, who should also make you feel like you have permission to just, even if you don't have much time, just comment. Like the government will forgive you because they also forgave Hoopu app. Do you want to summarize for our audience what Hoopu app was?
So when you go on a hike and then you see some poop and you're like, wow, I wonder what kind of poop that is, as you would. Well, you can take out this app and you can take a picture of it, and then they have like forums to discuss the poop.
You can join the scat identification community, which honestly, like we're making fun of it, but if you're an outdoorsy person, like honestly, like I have looked at poop and thought that, I
That's
used
a
to be into like,
quote. I'm grabbing that as a quote, and putting it. I'm gonna save it forever. That's incredible. I have looked at poop and thought that. That's what Igor said just now. So,
I used to be into survival, and I used to like study, like how to identify whether it's like
uh-huh.
deer or something else. And based
Mm-hmm.
on poop, you can also do that. You can see, oh, are there like foxes around? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's. I'm just saying, like I get it, and like all credit to Hoopu app. Like I want to give them two praises. They are inclusive. They're available in English, French, German, Russian, and Gaelic. Which,
The
when's the
most
last
inclusive
time?
language.
Yeah, when's the last time you saw somebody go make that effort? And two, their take was pretty good. Like they sent in a good comment. Granted, the comment was apparently sent as a PNG in the attachment, which is a choice.
That's so good. I did not know that part. Oh my god, that's hilarious.
But in the text comment, also in the PNG that was rendered from that, they make a very concrete point that like biometrics should not be used as part of overall like government process. I'm not sure if it was relevant for this comment, but it's a correct point, and they correctly state that people of non-white complexion are heavily disfavored by the accuracy of camera-based biometric security protocols, like being locked out and shit. So like, yeah, that's correct. So go Hoopu app. And this, whereas like I just found it funny because I'm 5, but I hope our listeners share the amusement, and at the very least, because I need to spin this to be useful, you should feel emboldened in the right to make comments. And you can apparently also do anonymous comments. I saw a bunch of anonymous comments. Those were all much inferior to Hoopu app's comment.
Obviously, for many reasons. And on that note, that is all. That is all the muck that we can handle for today.
Although it needs to be like maybe emphasized. What was the muck and what was the truth in today's episode?
Oh right, yeah. Sorry. I mean, so I think that the muck, really the only muck here, besides Hoopu, which is muck for a different reason, is there are portions of this that are sort of posturing, like it's great that the government is saying like we're not going to use this to target or profile people to like prevent free speech, but when they say that, they say it with like there's going to be no unlawful use of this to prevent free speech, meaning that like if they do it lawfully, it's okay. And they have these sort of hedges throughout those statements, which again, it's better than maybe if other governments or theoretical governments who might be in control would like craft such a thing like this. Like they would make it way more vague and way more easy to interpret in whatever way they wanted to. So like it's very nice that they are actually concrete. But we do have to remember that like they still will do whatever they want to do in this regard. At least that's my thought. However, like that's it, we have to get in pretty specific in order to see where the muck is here, which is just
from
not
the
the case.
Governmental side.
From the governmental side.
Like I was a bit more positive than you. Like as far as governments and like executive branches with basically godlike power on this earth go, this was pretty good for things that have legally binding repercussions if you get the wording wrong. I really thought like there was very little muck. The EU AI Act is, I think, a bit more stronger in what it bans, but then that's a different culture, and they still make affordances for like we can do this with a court order, we can do this here. They just much more clearly flat out ban stuff like automated facial identification and surveillance.
Mm-hmm.
Like because I guess Nazi history makes you do that. But the government side for me was basically muck free. It's just dry. The main muck for me is in this posturing, not from the government, but from our favorite frontier labs. That, especially like Entropic, we sometimes praised them, or I praise them sometimes. It's still pretty weak sauce to talk openly, oh, we want to be regulated and we want everything to be safe, and then water down regulation because you think AGI is inevitable and you need to be first. And you even, I assume accidentally, and maybe we should have actually asked them before we record this episode, but then we're doing this in our free time.
But they're not going to answer us.
We might as well ask.
There's no way. If they answer us, I will be shocked.
I have faith. Like, people are nice, people are in good faith, and I think it's still a good journalistic thing to do. But this is something from him. But like, the hyper focus on X risks causes them to be a harmful player in this because they're watering down regulation that would also protect other things from like against other things because of this. And I think that's like worth calling out. That's worth shaming. And like American for Prosperity, I think it's muck, but at least they're consistent as well. And Entropic and OpenAI should just be shamed to hell for still doing this double thing of, oh, we want to be regulated, but also please don't regulate us.
Yeah.
And
So
that is all the
that
muck we can
that
handle.
is all the muck that we can take for this week. Make sure to share the episode and the podcast and any other things that we've made on your social media and subscribe because it really helps the show. So if you like, I mean, we put a lot of effort into these episodes.
We did
Um,
4 hours in total production time. You get 1 hour of podcast. We have 3 hours of production today, and that is excluding research that we did before.
yeah, and
So,
then I also do more after that because
yes,
I
you will
do
editing.
post. So it is a lot, and we appreciate it. And I
Tweet
guess
at
that's all.
Jacob if you want him to reach out to Entropic with requests for
Well, we can
comments.
do that. We'll do it. We'll do it. I'll include a bit if they answer. And see you next time.